The city council chambers buzzed with anticipation on that warm September morning. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The appointment of a new police chief wasn't usually such a big event in Riverside, but today was different. Today would mark a historic change. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy wooden doors swung open. The room fell silent as a tall, distinguished man in his late 40s walked in, his crisp blue uniform adorned with medals and over 25 years of dedicated service. The new chief carried himself with quiet confidence, his salt and pepper hair and warm eyes giving him an approachable yet authoritative presence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Chen began, her voice steady and clear, "today marks a significant milestone for our city. After an extensive nationwide search and thorough evaluation of over 50 candidates, I am proud to announce our new chief of police." The new chief stood tall as the mayor continued listing his impressive qualifications: top of his class at the police academy, a master's degree in criminal justice from State University, successful leadership roles in 3 different police departments, and a track record of reducing crime while building strong community relationships. But not everyone shared the mayor's enthusiasm. In the front rows, where veteran officers sat in their dress blues, the atmosphere was notably different. Several of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging knowing glances. A few even crossed their arms, their body language speaking volumes about their disapproval of having their first black police chief. The new chief noticed these reactions but kept his expression neutral. He'd faced similar resistance throughout his career, starting as a rookie officer in a predominantly white department. Each promotion had come with its own set of challenges, but he'd learned to let his work speak for itself. As he approached the podium to give his acceptance speech, he caught sight of his wife and teenage daughter in the audience, both beaming with pride. Their presence reminded him of why he'd taken this position, despite knowing the challenges that lay ahead. "Thank you, Mayor Chen and members of the City Council," he began, his deep voice carrying naturally across the chamber. "I stand before you today not just as your new police chief, but as someone who believes in the power of positive change." He paused, making eye contact with various members of the audience. "I've spent my entire career working to make communities safer, to build trust between law enforcement and the people we serve. I've walked the beat, worked investigations, and led departments through challenges. But more importantly, I've learned that effective policing isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about understanding and serving our community." The tension in the room began to shift. Some of the initially skeptical officers found themselves nodding along as the chief outlined his vision for the department. He spoke about practical improvements, better training programs, updated equipment, and more opportunities for officer advancement. He emphasized the importance of both officer safety and community trust. However, the atmosphere changed when he mentioned his plans for reform. "We need to acknowledge that there's room for improvement," he stated firmly. "Our department must reflect the diversity of our community. We must ensure that every citizen, regardless of their background, feels protected and respected by law enforcement." At these words, Deputy Chief Anderson, a 30-year veteran of the force, visibly tensed. He whispered something to the officer next to him, causing several others to smirk. Their reaction didn't go unnoticed by the city council members or the local reporters covering the event. The new chief continued undeterred. "I look forward to working with each and every member of this department. Change isn't always easy, but I believe in our ability to grow and adapt together. My door will always be open for those who want to be part of building a better future for our community." As he concluded his speech, the applause was mixed. While most of the audience responded with enthusiastic support, a notable portion of the officers clapped with minimal enthusiasm, some barely moving their hands. The division was clear, but the new chief had expected this. He'd dealt with resistance before, and he knew that actions spoke louder than words. After the ceremony, as people filed out of the chambers, conversations buzzed with different perspectives. Community leaders expressed hope for positive changes, while some veteran officers huddled in small groups, their expressions guarded and discussions hushed. The new chief's first test came sooner than expected. As he walked toward his office, he overheard 2 senior officers talking around the corner. "This is going to be a disaster," one said. "He'll be gone within 6 months," the other replied, not realizing their new boss was within earshot. Instead of confronting them, the chief smiled to himself. He'd proved them wrong, not with words, but with results. As he entered his new office, he immediately began reviewing department files. He had plans to implement, changes to make, and a department to unite. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was more than ready for what lay ahead. Little did those resistant officers know their new chief wasn't just qualified. He was a master strategist who had spent his entire career preparing for this moment. The real question wasn't whether he could handle their resistance, but whether they were prepared for the level of positive change he was about to bring to the department. The resistance began subtly during the new chief's first week. Monday morning staff meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp, but when the chief walked into the conference room at 7:55, only 3 of the 12 senior officers were present. The others trickled in over the next 20 minutes, each offering casual excuses about traffic or last-minute calls. The chief noticed how the late arrivals chose seats as far from him as possible. Deputy Chief Anderson, who had shown his disapproval during the appointment ceremony, sat at the opposite end of the table, leaning back in his chair with an air of indifference. The message was clear. They weren't going to make this easy. "Let's discuss our community outreach initiatives," the chief began, spreading out several folders. Before he could continue, Officer Reynolds interrupted with a poorly hidden smirk. "With all due respect, Chief, we've got real police work to do. These community programs are just PR fluff." Several other officers nodded in agreement, exchanging knowing looks. The chief kept his voice steady as he replied, "Real police work includes building trust with our community. But first, let's review last month's crime statistics." He reached for the report he'd requested last week, only to find it missing from his files. "Oh, those reports?" Anderson drawled. "There must have been a mix-up. They're probably still being processed." The chief knew better. He'd seen the reports on Anderson's desk the day before. Throughout the week, similar incidents multiplied. Paperwork mysteriously disappeared or got lost in the system. Emails went unanswered. Radio calls were responded to with unusual delays when the chief was on the channel. During his walkthrough of the precinct, conversations would stop abruptly as he approached. Officers would suddenly find urgent matters to attend to, leaving break rooms and offices as soon as he entered. The whispers and sidelong glances followed him everywhere. The situation grew more obvious during patrol assignments. When the chief suggested rotating officers between different neighborhoods to improve community relations, he discovered his directives were being ignored. The same officers continued patrolling the same beats, maintaining their old patterns despite his direct orders. One afternoon, while reviewing body camera footage, he noticed something concerning. Officers were still using aggressive tactics during routine stops in minority neighborhoods, completely disregarding his new guidelines for community-sensitive policing. The chief decided to address these issues during Friday's briefing. As he discussed the importance of treating all citizens with equal respect, Officer Mitchell stood up, interrupting him mid-sentence. "Some of us have been doing this job for decades," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying across the room. "We know what works in our city. Maybe in your old department things were different, but here we have our own way of handling things." The room grew tense as other officers waited to see how their new chief would respond. Instead of taking the bait, he calmly replied, "Experience is valuable, Officer Mitchell. So is adaptation. The world is changing and we need to change with it." Later that day, the chief overheard a conversation around the corner that made his blood boil, though his face remained neutral. "He thinks he can come in here and change everything overnight," one officer said. "Give him a few months. He'll either learn to do things our way or he'll be gone." The final straw came when he discovered that community complaints were being buried before reaching his desk. A local pastor had tried 3 times to schedule a meeting about police conduct, but the front desk kept telling him the chief was unavailable. At home that evening, the chief sat in his study, reviewing the events of his first week. His wife brought him a cup of coffee and squeezed his shoulder supportively. "They're testing you," she said softly. "I know," he replied, his voice tired but determined. "They think this is a game of patience. They're waiting for me to either lose my temper or give up." He took a sip of coffee and smiled. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." Opening his laptop, he began documenting every incident of insubordination, every lost report, every ignored directive. He'd spent years preparing for this role, studying department politics and leadership strategies. These officers thought they were wearing him down, but they were actually giving him everything he needed to implement real change. As he worked late into the night, the chief thought about the younger officers he'd observed during the week, the ones who seemed uncomfortable with the old guard's behavior but were too intimidated to speak up. They were the key to transforming the department, and he already had plans for how to reach them. The resistance he'd faced this week wasn't just about him. It was about a system that desperately needed change. And despite what his opponents thought, their actions hadn't discouraged him. If anything, they'd only strengthened his resolve to succeed. The breaking point came during the third week of the new chief's tenure. The morning started like any other, with him arriving early to review overnight reports. As he read through them, a pattern emerged that made his jaw clench. Despite his clear directives about community-sensitive policing, the night shift had conducted an aggressive sweep through the city's east side neighborhoods. The reports showed that officers had stopped 43 vehicles in just 4 hours, all in predominantly minority areas. The reasons listed were vague: suspicious behavior, routine check, minor traffic violation. But what caught the chief's attention wasn't just the number of stops, it was the complete absence of similar operations in other parts of the city. He called an emergency staff meeting for 10 a.m. As usual, several senior officers arrived late, wearing expressions that mixed boredom with defiance. Deputy Chief Anderson strolled in last, coffee cup in hand, settling into his chair with deliberate slowness. "Would anyone care to explain last night's operation?" the chief asked, spreading the reports across the conference table. "I don't recall authorizing a targeted sweep of the east side." Anderson cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Chief, we've been running these preventative patrols for years. They're effective at deterring crime." Effective at deterring crime or effective at harassment? The chief countered, his voice level but firm. "Because these reports show 0 arrests, 0 contraband found, but dozens of citizens detained and searched without probable cause." The room grew tense as Anderson leaned forward. "Maybe where you came from, you did things differently. But here in Riverside, we have systems that work. Some people just need a stronger police presence to keep them in line." The chief felt his blood pressure rising but kept his expression neutral. "Some people? Would you care to elaborate on exactly who you mean by some people, Deputy Chief?" Before Anderson could respond, Officer Turner jumped in. "Look, everyone's thinking it, so I'll just say it. Crime rates are higher in those neighborhoods. That's just statistics. We're doing our job." "Interesting," the chief replied, pulling out another set of documents. "Because according to our actual statistics, crime rates are fairly consistent across the city. What's not consistent is how we enforce the law." He began laying out graphs and charts he prepared. In the West Side neighborhoods, officers give out warnings 70% of the time. In the East Side, it's arrests and citations 85% of the time. Same offenses, different outcomes. Anyone want to explain that? The silence in the room was deafening. Several younger officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while the veterans maintained stony expressions. Anderson finally broke the silence. "You can't just come in here and tear apart everything we've built. Some of us have been protecting this city since before you were even wearing a badge. Maybe the problem isn't our methods, maybe it's the leadership." The chief stood slowly, his presence commanding the room. "Let me be very clear. I'm not suggesting we stop enforcing the law. I'm ordering you to enforce it fairly and equally across all neighborhoods. Any officer who can't or won't do that should start looking for another job." "Is that a threat?" Anderson asked, his voice dangerously low. "No, Deputy Chief, that's a promise." After the meeting, the tension in the department reached new heights. Officers who had previously just ignored the chief's directives now actively worked to undermine them. Community complaints that should have reached his desk mysteriously vanished. Patrol reports were edited to remove controversial details. The situation came to a head during an afternoon briefing when the chief announced a new community oversight committee. Anderson stood up in the middle of the presentation, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You're turning this department into a joke. Some people aren't fit for leadership positions, and you're proving it every day." The room fell silent. Everyone knew exactly what Anderson meant by some people. The racial undertone was impossible to miss. The chief looked around the room, noting which officers nodded in agreement with Anderson and which ones looked away in discomfort. He'd been documenting every incident, every act of insubordination, every discriminatory pattern. He had expected this confrontation, had even planned for it. Instead of responding to Anderson's outburst, he calmly continued his presentation. But inside, he knew this was the moment everything would change. He had given them chances to adapt, to embrace new methods, to treat all citizens equally. They had chosen resistance instead. That evening, alone in his office, he began making calls to City Hall, the police union, and internal affairs. He had built a solid case over the past 3 weeks, documenting every violation, every instance of discrimination, every refusal to follow direct orders. The old guard thought they were pushing him to resign. Instead, they had given him everything he needed to clean house. As he reviewed his evidence one final time, he thought about all the good officers who wanted change, but were afraid to speak up. It was time to show them that doing the right thing wasn't just an option, it was the only way forward. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would show them exactly who was boss. Instead of meeting resistance with anger, the chief began implementing his carefully crafted strategy. Early Monday morning, before most officers arrived, he sat in his office reviewing the plan he'd developed over the weekend. The old guard expected him to fight fire with fire. They didn't realize he was about to change the entire game. His first move came as a surprise to everyone. He announced the installation of a new digital tracking system for all police activities. "This will streamline our paperwork," he explained during the morning briefing, watching Anderson and his allies shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Every patrol, every stop, every interaction will be logged automatically through our new cloud-based platform." What he didn't mention was that this system would make it impossible to lose reports or hide complaints. Every officer's actions would be tracked, time-stamped, and backed up to secure servers. No more mysterious disappearing paperwork. The resistance group tried their usual tactics. "The system's too complicated," one officer complained. "It's a waste of resources," another protested. But the chief had anticipated this. "The city council has already approved the budget," he announced, sliding copies of the signed documentation across the table. "And training begins tomorrow. Attendance is mandatory." He paused, making eye contact with each dissenting officer. "Anyone who fails to complete the training will be placed on administrative leave." That afternoon, he met with local community leaders in his office. Through his open door, officers watched as pastors, business owners, and neighborhood representatives came and went. The message was clear: the wall between the police and the community was coming down. But the chief's most strategic move came in the form of Officer Rodriguez, a young patrol officer who had recently been passed over for promotion despite an exemplary record. The chief called him in for a meeting. "Your file shows outstanding community policing skills," the chief said, reviewing Rodriguez's performance reports. "Yet you've been stuck on night patrol for 3 years. Want to tell me why?" Rodriguez hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Deputy Chief Anderson said I wasn't ready for more responsibility. But honestly, sir, I think it's because I spoke up about some of the targeting I saw in minority neighborhoods." The chief nodded, unsurprised. "How would you like to head our new community outreach division?" Word of Rodriguez's promotion spread quickly through the department. Other officers who had been silenced or sidelined under the old guard began coming forward, sharing their experiences and ideas for improvement. The chief's next step was implementing mandatory body cameras, but with a twist. "These aren't just for accountability," he explained during training. "They're for officer protection. When you do your job right, these cameras are your best friends." He showed footage from another department where body cameras had exonerated officers from false complaints. The younger officers particularly paid attention, seeing how technology could work in their favor. As these changes rolled out, the chief noticed subtle shifts in the department's dynamics. Officers who once avoided eye contact now nodded in greeting. Some even began stopping by his office to share concerns or suggestions. The turning point came during a tense situation in a local neighborhood. A young officer radioed for backup during a potentially volatile crowd situation. Following the new protocols, she had engaged with community leaders first instead of calling for immediate crowd control. The chief himself responded to the scene, arriving to find the situation already calming down. The officer had handled it perfectly, proving that the new approach could work. He made sure to commend her publicly at the next department meeting. Anderson and his allies watched their influence waning as success stories mounted. Their attempts to undermine the new systems backfired as the digital tracking revealed patterns of discriminatory policing they could no longer deny. The chief also began hosting monthly town halls, inviting officers and community members to discuss concerns openly. At first, only a few officers attended, but as they saw positive media coverage and growing community support, more began participating. Behind the scenes, he was building a comprehensive case. Every instance of insubordination, every discriminatory action, every violation of the new policies was documented meticulously. The digital system captured what the old guard tried to hide, while body cameras recorded what they said when they thought no one was listening. One evening, as he reviewed the mounting evidence, his secretary brought in a stack of emails from officers requesting transfers to the new Community Outreach Division. The old guard's grip on the department was weakening, and they knew it. But the chief knew better than to celebrate too early. Anderson and his supporters were growing desperate, and desperate people often made dangerous moves. He'd seen it before, the moment when cornered opponents lashed out most violently. As he prepared to leave that evening, he received a call from Internal Affairs. They had found something in the digital archives, something that would change everything. The chief listened carefully, his expression growing serious. Tomorrow would be the day he'd been waiting for. The old guard thought they were wearing him down, but they had actually given him exactly what he needed. Now it was time to show them what real leadership looked like. Building a coalition for change wasn't just about confronting the old guard, it was about empowering those who wanted to make a difference. The chief began identifying officers who shared his vision, particularly among the younger ranks who had been silenced by the previous leadership. Officer Chen was the first to step forward. She had graduated top of her class at the academy, but spent 3 years on desk duty because she'd reported excessive force by a senior officer. The chief moved her to field training, where her excellent communication skills could influence new recruits. "Your approach to community policing is exactly what we need," he told her during their first meeting. "I want you to help shape the next generation of officers." The pride in her eyes confirmed he'd made the right choice. Word spread quickly through the department. Officers who had been passed over for promotions or shut out of special units began requesting meetings with the chief. Each brought stories of witnessing discrimination or being pressured to ignore misconduct. The chief listened carefully to every story, documenting patterns and identifying potential leaders. He noticed that many of these officers had excellent records but had been systematically held back by Anderson and his allies. One morning, Officer Thompson, a quiet veteran with 20 years on the force, knocked on his door. "Chief, I've been wanting to speak up for years," he said, closing the door behind him. "I've seen how certain neighborhoods get targeted, how complaints disappear. I kept quiet to protect my pension, and I'm not proud of that." The chief leaned forward, interested. Thompson wasn't part of Anderson's group, but he wasn't known for causing trouble either. "It's never too late to do the right thing," the chief replied. Thompson pulled out a notebook. "I've been keeping records, dates, incidents, names, things that didn't sit right with me. Maybe it can help." The chief spent hours reviewing Thompson's detailed notes, which provided crucial evidence of long-term discriminatory practices. The chief's next move was implementing a mentorship program, pairing experienced officers who supported reform with promising rookies. This created a support network that could withstand pressure from the old guard. He also reached out to community leaders who had been trying to improve police relations for years. Mrs. Washington, a respected community organizer, became a regular visitor to the department. Her presence in the building sent a clear message: things were changing. During one community meeting, a young officer spoke up about his own experiences growing up in a neighborhood where police were feared rather than trusted. The room fell silent as he shared his perspective on why building community trust mattered. The chief watched proudly as more officers began sharing their stories. Each honest conversation helped break down the walls between the police and the community they served. The department's annual charity basketball game became another opportunity for change. Instead of the usual police versus community format, the chief mixed the teams. Officers and community members played side by side, building relationships through friendly competition. Local media took notice. A reporter interviewed several officers about the changes in the department. "It's like we can finally breathe," one officer said. "We're doing real police work now, not just following some unwritten rules about who to target." But the old guard wasn't going down without a fight. They started spreading rumors about declining arrest numbers, claiming the new approach was making the city less safe. The chief countered with data showing that community trust was leading to more tips and better crime-solving rates. Support came from unexpected places. A retired sergeant who had left the force years ago had reached out. "I quit because I couldn't stand the discrimination," he explained. "But what you're doing now? This is what real policing should be." The chief invited him to speak at Roll Call, where his stories of the old days helped younger officers understand why change was necessary. More retired officers began coming forward, offering support and sharing their own experiences with departmental racism. One morning, the chief arrived to find a group of officers waiting for him. They had drafted proposals for additional reforms, showing initiative and leadership. Among them was Rodriguez, now thriving in his new role. "We've been meeting after shifts," Rodriguez explained, "planning how to make things better. There are more of us who want change than anyone realized." The chief smiled, remembering his own early days as an officer who dared to challenge the status quo. These officers weren't just following his lead, they were becoming leaders themselves. As he watched them present their ideas, the chief knew he had achieved something crucial. The department's future wouldn't depend on him alone. He had built a team of officers committed to fair and equal justice, officers who would carry these changes forward long after he was gone. But even as he celebrated these victories, the chief remained vigilant. Anderson and his supporters had been unusually quiet lately. Experience had taught him that such silence often preceded a storm. He was right to be concerned. The next morning, an envelope appeared on his desk that would force everything into the open. The time for gradual change was over. The real battle was about to begin. The envelope on the chief's desk contained exactly what he needed: proof that Anderson and his allies had been falsifying reports to discredit the new administration. But what they didn't know was that the chief had been building his own case all along. Early that morning, before the sun had risen, the chief sat in his office reviewing everything one last time. The digital tracking system had captured it all: deleted complaints, manipulated crime statistics, and selective enforcement patterns that couldn't be explained away. At 7 a.m. sharp, he made 3 calls, one to the mayor, one to internal affairs, and one to the police union representative. By 8 a.m., all 3 had reviewed the evidence and agreed this couldn't be ignored. The chief scheduled an emergency department meeting for 9 a.m. As officers filed into the conference room, they could feel something was different. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Anderson and his group arrived last, wearing their usual smug expressions. They had no idea what was coming. The chief stood at the front of the room, his face unreadable as he waited for everyone to settle. "Before we begin," the chief announced, "I want to acknowledge something. Change is hard. Some of you have been doing things a certain way for a long time. I understood there would be resistance when I took this job." He paused, making eye contact with several officers. "What I didn't expect was the deliberate sabotage of department operations, the intentional manipulation of crime statistics, the systematic burial of civilian complaints." Anderson's face tightened. "Those are serious accusations, Chief. I hope you can back them up." The chief smiled slightly. "Funny you should mention that." He pressed a button on his laptop, and a projection screen lit up behind him. "Let's start with these deleted complaint files that mysteriously reappeared in our system backups." For the next 30 minutes, the chief laid out his case. He showed emails discussing plans to undermine his authority. He displayed side-by-side comparisons of original reports and their altered versions. He revealed audio recordings from body cameras that captured inappropriate comments and admissions of misconduct. "But here's what really concerns me," the chief continued, clicking to the next slide. "These falsified crime statistics that were sent to City Hall. That's not just departmental misconduct, that's fraud." The room had grown so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Several officers were staring at their hands. Others were looking at Anderson and his supporters with growing anger as they realized how they'd been manipulated. One of Anderson's closest allies stood up, his face red. "You can't prove any of this was intentional. Maybe there were some mistakes, but—" "Officer Brown," the chief interrupted. "2 hours ago, Internal Affairs seized all department computers. They're being analyzed as we speak. Would you like to rethink your statement?" The chief turned to address the entire room. "I'm going to make this very simple. In the next 48 hours, anyone involved in these activities has one choice to make. You can resign immediately, or you can face criminal charges." Anderson jumped to his feet. "This is a witch hunt. You can't do this to us. We've given our lives to this department." "No," the chief replied calmly. "You've used this department to maintain a system of discrimination and corruption. That ends today." He picked up a stack of papers from the podium. "These are resignation forms. They include a non-disclosure agreement. Sign them, and you can leave with your basic pension intact. Refuse, and the evidence goes to the district attorney." The chief watched as the realization spread across their faces. They weren't just being asked to leave, they were being given a chance to avoid prosecution. "You have until Friday at 5 p.m. to decide. After that, this evidence goes public." The chief's voice was firm but not vindictive. "Choose wisely." As officers filed out of the room, many looked shell-shocked. The younger officers were whispering among themselves, while Anderson and his supporters huddled in a corner, their faces pale. One veteran officer lingered behind. "Chief," he said quietly, "I knew things weren't right, but I had no idea how deep it went. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." The chief nodded. "It's not about what happened in the past. It's about what we do now. Are you ready to be part of the solution?" Throughout the day, a steady stream of officers came to his office. Some wanted to share additional information about past misconduct. Others wanted to express their support for the changes ahead. By evening, 3 resignation letters had appeared on his desk. More would follow. The old guard's reign was ending, not with a bang, but with the quiet shuffle of paperwork. As the chief prepared to leave that night, he paused to look at the department photos on the wall. Soon, these would be replaced with new ones, photos showing a department that truly served and protected all its citizens equally. The hard part wasn't over. Change never comes easily. But today had proven what he'd known all along. When confronted with the truth, even the strongest resistance crumbles. 6 months after the confrontation, the Riverside Police Department had undergone a remarkable transformation. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the chief's office as he reviewed the latest department statistics. The numbers told a story that even the biggest skeptics couldn't deny. Civilian complaints had dropped by 40% across all neighborhoods. Response times were faster and crime clearance rates had improved significantly. But the most telling change wasn't in the statistics, it was in the daily interactions between officers and citizens. Walking through the department that morning, the chief noticed Officer Chen training a group of new recruits. "Community trust isn't just a buzzword," she was saying. "It's the foundation of effective policing. When people trust us, they help us solve crimes and keep neighborhoods safe." The new recruits were the most diverse group in the department's history. Young men and women from all backgrounds had been drawn by the department's growing reputation for fairness and professionalism. The old guard's predictions of disaster had proven completely wrong. In the break room, the chief overheard 2 veteran officers discussing a recent case. "Remember how we used to handle these situations?" one asked. "All that aggressive tactic stuff just made things worse. This new approach actually works better." His partner nodded. "Yeah, and my job satisfaction is way up. Turns out treating people with respect makes our jobs easier, who knew?" They'd both laughed, not realizing their chief was listening with a smile. The department's community outreach program, led by Officer Rodriguez, had become a model for other cities. Their monthly town halls were now standing room only, with citizens and officers engaged in honest, productive discussions about neighborhood safety. One elderly resident had tears in her eyes during the last meeting. "I've lived here 40 years, she said, "and this is the first time I felt like the police were really here to protect us, not just police us." The chief's phone buzzed with a text from the mayor. The City Council had unanimously approved their budget request for additional community policing initiatives. Even former critics had been won over by the dramatic improvements in police-community relations. Later that day, the chief visited the training academy where a new program was in session. Officers were learning de-escalation techniques and cultural awareness alongside traditional police skills. The old approach of viewing every situation as a potential threat had been replaced with a more balanced perspective. Your primary weapon isn't your gun, the instructor was saying. It's your ability to communicate and understand the people you serve. The chief noticed several officers nodding in agreement, the same officers who had once resisted these ideas. In the detective division, the solve rate for serious crimes had improved dramatically. It's amazing what happens when people trust us enough to come forward with information, one detective commented during their weekly briefing. The chief's reform policies had attracted national attention. Other departments were sending officers to learn from their example. The same changes that Anderson and his supporters had claimed would destroy the department had instead made it stronger. Walking through the neighborhood that afternoon, the chief saw examples of the transformation everywhere. Officers were out of their cars, talking with residents, knowing people by name. Children waved at passing patrol cars instead of running away. At a local coffee shop, he overheard two residents talking. "Did you hear about Officer Thompson? He helped my grandson get into the youth mentorship program. These new officers actually care about our community." Back at the station, the chief reviewed applications for upcoming promotions. The criteria had changed. Now leadership potential was judged not just by arrest numbers, but by community engagement and problem-solving skills. The old photos in the hallway had indeed been replaced. New images showed officers and citizens working together at community events, youth programs, and neighborhood meetings. The faces in the photos reflected the diversity of the city they served. That evening, as the chief prepared to leave, a young officer stopped by his office. "Chief, I just wanted to say thank you. When I was in the academy, people told me I'd have to choose between being a good cop and being true to my principles. You showed us we can be both." The chief thought about how far they'd come. Anderson and his supporters were gone, along with their toxic influence. Some had resigned, others had retired, and a few faced consequences for their actions. But their departure had made room for positive change. The department's success had proven that good policing wasn't about force or fear. It was about service, respect, and justice for all. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every challenge. As he drove home that night, the chief passed through various neighborhoods of the city. In each one, he saw officers engaged with the community, doing their jobs with pride and professionalism. The dream of fair and equal justice wasn't just a slogan anymore, it was becoming reality. 6 months had changed more than just policies and procedures. It had changed hearts and minds, proving that one person's determination, combined with the support of those who believed in justice, could transform an entire institution. The Riverside Police Department had become a beacon of hope, showing other cities that positive change was possible.